Welcome to the Microdosing for Healing podcast. I'm your host, Casey Garrett, and together we'll be discovering and learning from inspiring voices of healers, medicine keepers, and visionaries. Every episode, we'll explore the world of health, vibrant wellness, and natural medicine for a new era of human society. Welcome to today's episode. Hello, everybody, and welcome to the podcast. Today, we have a special treat for you today. I have been hanging out for some time to do an episode on our topic today, which is LSD microdosing. So of all the microdosing medicines, I have found that LSD has the most reaction from people. It has certainly garnered the most stigma, and that has been much to our detriment. I waited for quite a long time. Those of you who have been hanging out with me for some time know I came to medicine practice. I had a grand mal seizure disorder. So when I started microdosing, I was very wary of anything that would destabilize my mind when it was doing it on its own. And for that reason, I was very shy about LSD for many years, even far past when I had begun microdosing with mushrooms. However, I was called to this medicine in a big way this year, and I must say it has been profound and significant. And so I am so excited to share more about this medicine and topic with probably one of the best people in the world to share this topic, as he is one of the founders of microdosing LSD and exploring this as a medicine, as a microdosing medicine in our modern times today. So please welcome Dr. James Fadiman and Jordan Gruber with us today. Great to have you guys. Thank you for being with us. So, Jim, if you don't mind starting off with us, for people who have never heard of LSD, when was LSD discovered and what is it? How does it work with the body?
Well, let's do the easy part first. It was synthesized first in 1938 by Albert Hofmann, who was synthesizing derivatives of lysergic acid diethylamide, LSD. The one that we're interested in was LSD 25, which meant he had 24 that were not of much use to him. He gave it to the mice who waited for these things, and they all lay around. And since he couldn't tell how happy they were, all he noticed is that they didn't do much. So he made some notes that they didn't do much, put it back on the shelf, and went for LSD 26. Several years later, and there's lots of mythology about it, he had an intuition that it would be a good idea to retest LSD 25. So he resynthesized it, and in so doing, perhaps got a tiny bit onto a cut on his finger. Now, a tiny bit with LSD, we're talking literally millionths of a gram. And he had a very strong experience, quite disturbing, wonderful, puzzling. And he was enough of a scientist as he lay kind of at home recovering and feeling pretty good about it. He thought, well, maybe it was that substance that I was working with today. So he went back to the lab, and being a good scientist, he took the smallest amount he could conceive of it having an effect. That's 250 micrograms. Now, when we get talking about microdosing, we'll talk 10 micrograms, but 250 micrograms is a big slug. And he bicycled home, a famous bicycle ride.
With an assistant.
To make sure that he made it. And you've seen the pictures of kind of upside down mountains and the rest. And so he had a very typical 250 mic experience. And that's what started looking at LSD, because obviously what he learned is it was the strongest substance in the known universe that could affect consciousness that much. Now, how does it work in the body? The honest answer is we haven't really a very good idea. The long answer that you'll read in endless papers is it affects one particular neuron, 5-2A, and it affects it in different ways by different theorists. And that neuron somehow affects all kinds of systems in the body. Recent research, not surprisingly, found that it's this little teeny molecule is actually how much LSD is 1.5 quadrillion?
Yeah, 1 microgram is 1.54 quadrillion molecules of it.
So there's lots of molecules to go to every cell of the body. And we find that LSD affects systems all over the body in ways that we don't quite know. What we do know is it's physiologically incredibly safe. It is almost impossible to injure yourself by overdosing. And we're talking about overdoses of 50 times, overdose of 500 times. So we're talking about a very safe substance. And one that has an amazing, leads to amazing shifts in consciousness, and in microdosing, affects all bodily systems.
So let me add in a couple of things. I learned that yesterday was the 87th birthday of the initial discovery of LSD.
Hooray.
Which I thought was interesting. And that Hoffman was originally starting on some plant called a squill, SQUILL, and that the thing with ergots was just as like a side job that he happened to look into, and then it got more interesting. So I think we do know some of the ways that it affects the body. And I want to say just straight off that I'm with you. It's my favorite substance overall. I think that it's the easiest to dose right, assuming you're getting good stuff to begin with. For a few reasons, psilocybin can be more complicated. And it's just the cleanest, and it's the easiest to bring in and bring out without all of the things that psilocybin wants to make you do. And I know we'll get back to that. But in terms of the function, we do know that there is an impact on neuroplasticity. We do know that it has an anti-inflammatory effect. I'm almost comfortable with saying we do know there is a positive mitochondrial effect, but Wendy's got to write me that paper first, and I've got to edit it for her so that I'm absolutely sure I understand all of it. And we do know absolutely, because of the work of Connor Murray and Harriet DeWitt's lab, that there's no question, A, if it's just a placebo, because B, there is a sweet spot that if you're below which it doesn't work for most people, although that number keeps going down. And certainly if you're on top of that sweet spot range, then either no effects or worse effects happen for people. So we know that with hard, scientific, double-blind, placebo-based, objective brainwave-based proof. It still needs to be replicated more, but nonetheless, we know that it's this very powerful medicine when people use it in the microdosing range. And we need to always be clear what that is for different people and some of the confusions that started and what people have said. And even today, you asked about research. We were talking back and forth, and we'll get to that later. But there's some research out there that wasn't done well. It didn't test microdoses. It tested low doses, and they got bad results. So no surprise.
So that's the basics.
Thank you. Yeah, we'll get to that study in a bit for sure. Jim, can you take us back to, so it was discovered in the 40s, but then into the 50s and 60s, LSD was being researched for, I know the government got its hands on it and some pharmaceutical companies had their hands on it. How did it come into, take us through those years. Yeah, take us through those years, and how did you come to focus on microdosing?
Well, Sandoz Pharmaceuticals, Doc Hoffman's boss, so to speak, his company, didn't know what to do with it. He gave it to a couple of his senior colleagues, and they all had very far out kinds of experiences. They were definitely not necessarily good or bad, because they kept their eyes open and they talked. They did all the things that kind of dampen LSD's effect. But they got that this was something. They then did what companies do, which was, how can we make money out of this? What could it be good for that people would buy it? And they had no idea. And literally, there were several years where they would send it to people, and you had to have stationery that vaguely indicated you had an advanced degree. They weren't, because I know people who made their own stationery, undergraduates, and they would get from Sandoz a little box of little glass ampules, and in each ampule was 25 micrograms. Now, 25 micrograms is also a considerable dose, more than a microdose. So there's almost no microdosing study for years, because the smallest dose the company sent you in a liquid was 25 micrograms. It had the CIA in the United States became interested because if it made people feel uncertain of their identity, uncertainty of where they were, uncertainty maybe of their political allegiance, who knew? Maybe they could use it as a mind either control or fright drug. And they did a huge amount of research, some of it far too awful even to describe. And there is a book called Poisoner in Chief about all of those studies. And they came up with the realization that it didn't work very well for what they had. One of my favorite pieces of research was they outfitted a whorehouse in San Francisco, and the prostitutes would give LSD within a cocktail to Johns, in this case, very often returning military, and then they would be observed through double-sided windows. They didn't learn much, but as the person who did most of the viewing said, it was wonderful fun for him. It wasn't very much fun for the soldiers. So they basically, the CIA gave up on it and literally, physically destroyed all of their records they could when Congress started to look at it a few years later. One box in the back of a closet escaped. So we have a little bit of an idea of what the government imagined it was doing. So that didn't work out. Psychologists and psychiatrists began to see that people who had a good LSD experience felt better in some way. And by the time LSD was made illegal, there were 40,000 subjects who had successfully used LSD in clinical settings. When I got first interested, I wrote Sandoz, I was a first-year graduate student, and said, is there any research? I got 2 huge volumes from Switzerland, which was only the abstracts of the first 1,000 studies. At the time when the US government declared by fiat that it had no medical use and a high degree of possible addiction, neither of which were true, it was the research psychiatric drug on the planet. And then all research was shut down. The US government asked a lot of other countries, would they also ban it in that friendly way that only the largest bully on the block can ask you questions. And there were 40 years where very little happened on the surface and a worldwide underground, of course, established. There's a rule of thumb that if people want something and you make it illegal, you are basically establishing a place for criminality to flourish. So we had LSD pretty much available through all the down years, and then the research started again, and it's now considered a great breakthrough in a lot of areas, almost all high dose. Microdosing, slightly different. So try and keep microdosing brief. Microdosing did start with LSD because I had lunch with Robert Forte, F-O-R-T-E, a kind of underground interesting person through psychedelics. And he said that Albert Hofmann had told him that these very, very low doses, this is now many years later, were great for clearing your thinking. And he recommended that it was good to take it and take a walk in the woods to think. That was maybe 20 micrograms, and I heard that as 10 micrograms. So I recommended to some of my friends in Santa Cruz, would you be interested in taking? I didn't have to finish the sentence with some of these people. And they reported on 10 micrograms that they liked it. It felt good. And then what they said, and this was the first discovery, a very important one, the next day they said they felt just as good. Now, LSD had left their system. So here was this phenomena, which we call the second day effect. And that's what got my curiosity going. And I started asking people for more details other than, hey, man, that was great. And here we are.
Amazing. Amazing. I would love to share a little bit of my experience microdosing with LSD for the first time, and then hear from you guys, because you've studied so many people, some of the benefits that people and the breadth of benefits that people experience. So I noticed immediately, I was floored after working with mushrooms so much with the consistency of experience with LSD. It was
Nice.
fascinating. It was just after 1 week, I knew exactly how I was going to feel on the dose day, exactly on the second day, and exactly on the third day, which after working with mushrooms, those of you who've worked with mushrooms know there is no consistency with mushrooms. Mushrooms largely have their own plan for you. So that was remarkable. And I also felt this levity and lightness. It made me feel that the closest I could come to the feeling in describing it to people was when I was a little kid, like a lot of little kids, I loved to roller skate. We would go to the roller rink and skate and skate and skate for hours. And there was this feeling of freedom when you were on the skating rink in motion. And that's how I felt. That's how my spirit felt, microdosing with LSD. I was also much more playful. It was a very heavy time. It's a very heavy time in the human world right now. And I noticed I could still be aware of what was going on in the world and read the news, but it wasn't grabbing and holding me down the way it was. I could maintain a sense of levity. I found myself more playful and light. My sense of humor dialed all the way back to its full velocity. And also, I think after doing so much work, a lot of people who come to mushroom practice come to do the work. They're like there for it, right? They're there to do the deeper work, the heavy work, the emotional work. And it was almost like LSD was the cherry on top. For me, it was in a way, Spirit was saying, work can also be expansive and playful and light and joyful. And that's every bit as meaningful as doing kind of the heavier shadow work that you're doing. So it's been a beautiful experience. And I found it very integrating of all of the other work that I've ever done.
The image that comes to mind, it's the person who is filled with light. And wherever they look, they are not casting a shadow. LSD feels that way, where the part of you that is always content, always observing, always fascinated by the drama that your life is, the 100-act play of our lives. And a part of you says, that was terrific. Oh, I love the way you screamed and sobbed about that. Oh, wow, you really love pumpkin pie. Isn't that fascinating? That part of you, which is totally observant, totally supportive, and totally not upset. Detached is too, sounds like you don't care, but it's indeed, as a child, when you go out and, oh my God, the lawn is back. So LSD has that cheerfulness. And if you kind of look at the what we call the 60s, it's really filled with cheerful ways of being, wearing wonderful clothes, dances, music, changing the social order, but always in a way towards that more people suffer less. So it's in a sense impersonal, but in the most positive way. So I'm delighted by your description because you had already worked on yourself. So your system said, well, you don't really have to do any more work for a while. You now get to appreciate who you are. And that in itself is really a life-changing for many people event.
So I want to say two things about this. The first is that this melds very much with our idea of your symphony of cells and the idea of healthy multiplicity, and that you do have multiple cells. And by toning down the default mode network and putting more entropy in your brain, or making more connections possible, or desync, however you want to talk about it, you have the opportunity to go into a new attractive basin of personality. That is one that was, maybe like when you first ever got high, or back when you were a kid, way before you needed to get high, and you can just kind of like snap into that part of who you are and stay there for 6 or 8 hours. And the other thing is, we've talked about this before, is that, and not everybody agrees with this, is that psilocybin, because it does, assuming you're taking psilocybin, not just psilocin, but if you're taking an extract of a whole mushroom, it does involve the spirit of the plant somehow. It does involve the entourage chemicals. It does make you want to work. Like you said, it wants to, whether it's your body stuff or your emotional stuff or your karmic stuff that you usually don't think of, the more, and for me, the more psilocybin I take, the more it gets like very upfront and personal about, you're going to do that. Well, LSD goes back to this. It's more of a non-specific amplifier, which I learned is a Stan Grof term. But it's where you point it. But I do think that you've made a really good point that it also has that element of joy and ecstasy and enthusiasm that was a hallmark signature of the 1960s. And again, when you said the consistency, again, different types of psilocybin, even the same psilocybin containing mushrooms can give you different experiences, but, different types have different amounts of everything and will affect you differently. And depending on how healthy your liver and intestines and digestive system is, that's going to change what's going on with you as well. And so it's there are more variables in psilocybin for sure.
I'd love to ask about the protocol. So the Fadiman protocol, those of you listening who have heard, yes, it's the same guy. It's him. He came up with it. I could see completely once I started working with LSD, I was like, that's why I can see why this is the perfect protocol for LSD, because I noticed that when I was doing the Fadiman protocol, which was 1 day on, 2 days off, the first day and the second day, I love to write, and I noticed I was just writing effortlessly and way longer into the night. It was like my day was effortlessly stretched out and so consistent. It was like that on the first 2 days consistently. So how did you come up with that?
Well, confession. It was not ever designed to be therapeutically perfect. What it was designed to do is I was trying to find out what on earth was going on other than, hey, man, it's cool. So people said, I feel great. And then they said, second day, I feel great. And I thought, well, if you then take it again, you're just going to keep feeling great. And I'm not going to get any new information. My goal was take that third day off so you'll come back down. So on the fourth day, you'll go back up and I'll start to get new information. So it was actually a research protocol. It was, so to speak, it escaped from the lab. And people started doing that. And since it was super safe, and you couldn't stop anyone anyway, I was very supportive of, again, finding out what people found out. And what we did find out, and we did some very close measurement of a couple of hundred people, is after maybe 10 Fadiman protocol cycles, that third day also was fine. And the reason is that whatever it was in your system that was a little out of synchronization was now better synchronized. If you were had been clinically depressed, you were no longer depressed for many people, and a lot of other conditions. So the 3-day cycle became popular on its own because, there was no way to stop it. And now it is still the most popular protocol. It may not be and it's not ideal for everyone for everything, like nothing is, but it's the easiest and safest. The only one that is easier is every other day, because then you don't have to remember hard things like, can I count to 7 in threes?
And there was a sleep study that showed that on the second day, we have at least one study saying people got statistically significantly more sleep on the second
day, not the first day.
But only on LSD. That doesn't happen on psilocybin.
Well, we don't have that study. We don't have it.
It has been tested for psilocybin, yes.
And now,
I could see that. So Jim and Jordan just published a beautiful book that really speaks to the breadth of microdosing. Those of us in the field, oftentimes people hear us speak about it and say, can this little substance do so much good in all of these areas? And yes, it can.
So far.
Mm-hmm.
And the answer is you need to change your framework. See, pharmaceuticals are designed with two things in mind. One is you should have to buy more. Two is they are usually symptom specific. And therefore what they do is suppress a symptom. Like when you take aspirin for a headache, whatever the cause of the headache is, it doesn't go away, but you don't experience it. That's suppression. Psychedelics in general, and microdosing in particular, have a different mode of action, which is they affect the entire body. They are much more, well, as some people have said, well, nothing could be good for everybody. And everyone goes, yeah, that's true. I say, well, about sleep, is that good for everybody? Well, yeah, everybody. How about improving your diet? Is that good for everybody? Well, yeah, it's kind of good for everybody. How about improving your relationships? Well, yeah, that's really good for everybody. So there are a few things that are good for everybody. And then there are vitamins, which you don't take for a symptom, you take to improve your body's functioning. And microdoses seem to be much closer to the vitamin model, which is they're not good for everybody, probably, but they are super safe and they affect all bodily systems. So whatever is out of whack tends to get recalibrated more correctly. And we're talking about a lot of physical conditions as well as mental conditions.
And before we leave the whole every third day, 1 day on and 2 days off, and why that's so good, in some of our later talks and podcasts, we've come up with the metaphor that it's like, you're doing sculpture and you're kicking the
pottery wheel.
The pottery wheel, thank you. You don't have to keep kicking all the time. So with microdosing, you sort of kick it once, and then 2 or 3 days later, come back when it's starting to slow down. But the different systems in your body are you have more time to learn how to use what it's providing, and there's enough momentum that's sort of optimal without having any other negative effects on your life. So that's why it also seems to work. We come back to less is more and less is enough, and the idea that, you might not need it every day. And sometimes we've run into a couple of people who are doing unconventional protocols, and they do it every day, or they even take psilocybin LSD every day for pain, and it works. And it's like, everyone is going to be different, but for most people, say we don't know that this magic vitamin is good for everybody, but it might be good for, a whole lot of people.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Let's talk about dosing, because when I have microdose, I use 10 micrograms, which was perfect for me. Like spot on, perfect. Some of the folks in my community have said their perfect is about 5 to 7. Have you found in all of your experience and research, is there kind of an ideal range of microdosing for LSD?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. See, we kind of get into that pharmaceutical place where the pill has that much in it, period. And you're told don't mess with the pill. But in real life, if someone says to you, I'm going to serve you green beans, they don't say, I serve everybody 14 green beans. Okay, because we know that sometimes you're hungry, sometimes you're not, sometimes you don't like green beans, sometimes you can't imagine living without them. So you have to be in touch with yourself to determine what works for you. And I originally did what you did. I thought, 10 micrograms, that's perfect. God created humanity to take 10 micrograms. In fact, I invented, so that I would be famous, the term, that's a tenor. Fortunately, my kind of ignorance showed up fairly quick. And we got to people finding that there was a range for most people. And the top of that range has kept coming down over the years. And so what are we now down to?
And the bottom goes down too. I mean, so what we say in the book at this point is 5 to 12. What I have found in my experience is that I used to be 10, and now it's usually 6. If I go to 8, I know that I'm almost like, maybe this is a little bit I can tell, but if I know it's gone down over time. And what's really interesting and fascinating is that on Reddit, you'll find examples of people going 1, and in at least one case, 2 orders of magnitude lower than that, and it still works just fine. And that's when you get back to those numbers. If 10 micrograms has 15 quadrillion molecules in it, if you did 1, it's still 1.5, maybe that's more than, and how many cells you have in the human body, maybe 30 trillion. So it's a whole different order of magnitude.
What we've found when someone says, well, I took 5 micrograms and I was flattened for the day. The question, very simply, is, are you very sensitive to medications? So I had a friend who, whenever she was given any kind of medication, the first thing she did was cut it in half. Usually she had to cut it in half twice before it was normal for her. She was very sensitive. There are other people, and they're usually high-functioning autistic people, need more than the 10 or 12. So not surprisingly, human beings have a range of what works for them. And as Jordan points out, also a learning range and also a situational range.
It still says setting and dosage.
Right. So what we know from high doses is true at microdoses, just in much subtler ways. So again, what we've said to people is, and our other kind of mantra is, start low, meaning start below where you think it's going to work. And if you have no effects, good, you're in the right range so far. Raise it slowly. Take a couple of cycles before you raise it a little bit. And even with that, even taking it every 3 days with a low enough dose, the last part of our description is take time off. Now, that's peculiar because I take zero responsibility for that. Never occurred to me. And what we found is independently, and this is from people around the world, different groups, would come back to us and say, after 4 to 6 weeks, it just felt right to take time off. So now time off is built into the system. And of course, if one has any safety concerns, that just handles them. And what people do when they come back from their time off, they do three possibilities. One is they say, well, gee, I'm going to start with a higher dose. That's rare. I start with a lower dose, as Jordan was describing. That's common. And, oh, thank you very much. Whatever I was taking it for seems to not be a problem. I'm going to go on with my life.
So I will say that I also know a few people and circumstances in which taking time off is not part of the protocol. And this is mainly for athletes, certain long-distance runners, and other people. We know it's gotten big in long-distance running. I have another friend, and he's like, I take all the things that work for me, on a regular basis. And so he's in. So, our book is generally divided between physical and mental health conditions versus enhanced performance in arts and sports and anything you can think of. So if you're a performance aficionado, depending on, what you're doing and how you're doing it, and then even then I would agree that you do eventually want to take some time off. Every time I do take more time off than I want to, I'm glad I have.
So now remember, we're taking time off from taking something into your body. Your body doesn't stop healing itself. In fact, it seems to say, well, I've now learned enough or handled the worst parts where I needed the booster of a microdose, and my system will do fine. And there was a group of people, somebody who was very depressed, microdosed and stopped being depressed and got very excited and said, I'm going to turn on all my depressed friends. And I got a letter from her some weeks out, and she said, I have a question, which is, some of my friends who stopped being depressed stopped microdosing after 6 weeks or so. Others of my friends who had been chronically depressed after 6 weeks took time off and said within a week or two, their depressed symptoms kept returning. What's the difference between the two groups? Now, part of me, it's a very small part, is a research person. And I thought, oh my God, this is like a heaven-sent research project, and it's already done. All I have to do is pretend that I have some possible answer to her question. So I did what researchers do, which is, what do you think is the difference? But she knows all these people. And we talked back and forth, and what it was is the people who took it for depression and stopped being depressed, their lives were pretty well working. The people who went back to being depressed, their lives weren't working very well. So whatever it was that was making them depressed had not left their life. And from a common sense point of view, that makes sense. Which is if you take a medication so that you will feel better, when you feel better, you stop. If you're taking a medication for something that is built-in chronic, then you maintain that medication. So it's people actually behave the way sensible people would behave if they weren't being advised by researchers or physicians.
And the great thing about microdosing in all this context is a really high reward to risk ratio. Even if it doesn't work for you, it generally is not going to mess you up very badly, and it will quickly stop bothering you as soon as you stop. And yet the possible gains are really tremendous.
Wonderful. I know a lot of folks in our community will have the question, how is LSD microdosing different in the experience than psilocybin microdosing?
Well, I recommend they go to the bottom of this show where we started. And your description was really excellent, followed by Jordan's equally excellent description that psilocybin, and we're talking for 99.9% of people who use psilocybin, real mushrooms. And real mushrooms have different amounts of substances, and there's a lot of substances in there, a lot of other alkaloids that we have not investigated. But our personal theory is if it can take, 15 to 20 million years to develop the substance, you probably know what you were doing. So there are reasons they're there. So it is a little more complicated. You are dealing with natural substances. And it actually has probably a slightly different set of conditions that it's best for. In the book, we take the position that for most people, most of the time, you don't really have those choices available to you. And when you do, you pick the one that feels right. So there's been a growth over the years, both in the research world and in the underground world, which is much, 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 much larger, of people using mushrooms, because there's 200 species of mushrooms around the planet that contain psilocybin.
And it's become so much easier to grow it since, let's say, the 70s when the McKennas published their first pamphlet. You can now buy, a kit thing you add water to and put in your closet.
And 6 weeks later, you are.
I mean, I haven't done that. We
really should. I want the one that goes on your kitchen table with a plexiglass.
Okay.
It really is very easy. And I just corresponding with someone with lots of issues, but before she decided after she decided to microdose, she learned how to grow mushrooms. And she waited 6 weeks until she had her first flush of mushrooms. And now she's working with her own mushrooms in her own country at her, it's easier.
And if you believe in the care and the love that surrounds it while you're growing it, doing it yourself is a great solution. You're not trying to make money off yourself.
Exactly. I just had a testimony come in a couple of days ago from a client who worked with mushrooms first to taper. So they tapered off of an SSRI, an SNRI, and a sleeping medication as well over a couple of years. And then they said that when they went to microdose psilocybin, it was just quiet for the first time. They said nothing was happening. And we decided this was a sign maybe that it was time to work with a new medicine. And he began working with LSD. And he expressed that psilocybin helped him get beyond his experience of just managing life, keeping his depression at bay. And now with bringing LSD in, he's really fully embracing and enjoying his life and finding joy in his day-to-day.
And it's, again, we have similar things in the kind of physical medicine world as well. We're going to put you on something that's going to prevent you from dying. And the side effects, however, are bad enough, so we're going to put you on a second drug that's only for your side effects. And if you don't stop that cycle, older people sometimes are taking 10 medications, 4 of which are to protect them from 4 of the others. So what you're doing with psychedelics is you're finding what are the fine points between them and what's the most useful for each person during each experience. Because when someone this doesn't start by alleviating depression or having to get off medications, that's a very different starting place.
And while a lot of people do get benefit from SSRIs and SNRIs, unquestionably, when you think about how they work, it's a reuptake inhibitor. So the used serotonin molecules don't get to go up, and they want to be done, but they can't be, and they've got to go back in. So that's fine for some people, but that's as opposed to LSD, which is a serotonin agonist. actually bonds with and strengthens and works to produce more serotonin in a holistic and natural way comparatively, and with no side effects.
Mm-hmm.
And you've mentioned it because it's so common. One of the major uses for microdosing is to help you taper off of medications which either no longer work or the side effects outweigh whatever benefits you have. And what's interesting, not only antidepressants, but stimulants. So the two major areas that we looked at in the book, because we have the most cases, are ADHD, where you're on amphetamines, and depression when you're on SSRIs. And people getting off of each of those have very similar reports, which is the side effects were not worth it. And now I have almost or more of the effects I was hoping for with microdosing, and I can stop anytime I wish. They're not addictive.
Jordan, I want to ask you about a topic I know you're super passionate about, which is the research. And one of the studies you spoke to earlier that got a lot of attention, actually, you shared that they weren't actually using a microdose in that research. So can you share a little bit of people who are curious about where the research stands with LSD microdosing?
Well, there's some good research, positive research, the Connor Murray research, and in the write-up we do in the Flourish Academy with Connor, which is a PDF that we like to share, he talks about all of these things, including this study. But the ADHD study came out on March 19th. By the end of the month, nearly every news outlet you could find reported it as clinical study shows LSD microdosing does not work for ADHD. Now, if you look at that study very carefully, which I have, 10 out of 12 times they refer to it as a low-dose study. Twice they refer to it as microdosing, but say, we know this is very high for a microdose. And they have another discussion of how they went about double the usual rule of thumb for a microdose, which is 1/10 to 1/20 of a full recreational dose. So for LSD, a full recreational dose is 100 micrograms. And so they should have done 10, but they did 20. And yet the fact that they call it, the title of the paper is low dose study, they refer to it as low dose 10 times. And they make these caveats about, we decided we'd study twice what we knew was the best possible rule of thumb because we thought we'd see bigger results. So they literally, the idea that there is a peak efficacy zone or a sweet spot hasn't sunk in with these folks. And because of this company stopped its entire LSD for ADHD research program. But the real problem is that so many people read it as, and this will be the first thing you come up with if you Google it, LSD does not work for, microdose does not work for ADHD. And they didn't test it. We knew, I said it to one of our friends, and he said, duh, of course it would make it worse. People were dropping out. The usual stuff, it doesn't read at all like how we describe a microdose as having your average day with your normal day with no qualms and nobody knowing you're on anything. And it wasn't like that at all for these people because they absolutely studied an amount that wasn't the right amount. So they proved that low dosing is probably not going to work for ADHD. They proved absolutely zero. So it was a huge act of miscommunication. And there were some well-known people who were running the study. And when we talked about Connor with it, he said, yeah, he just, didn't really know how that could happen. They just weren't educated. So the opposite pole of that research is the 3 papers that Connor Murray has written coming out of Harriet DeWitt's lab in UCLA. And Jim and Connor have been friends for a long time and have talked. And it's no surprise that Connor, kind of focused on the right thing, but it was sort of an accident. So we've come up with this PDF that we want to share, and there's a link for that you can find on our website. But the bottom line is that he came up with research that showed on a subjective measure of it's called the ARCB scale, and then on 2 different objective measures involving brain waves and other neural correlates, one called neural complexity, there's absolutely no question that there is a sweet spot. And anybody who reads this PDF and anybody who looks at what Connor did is going to have to say, oh, we know now for real, which we already knew, of course, that LSD isn't just a placebo. But of course, you still see a lot of the psychedelic leadership and well-known people in the field if you ask them about microdosing and they're not involved with it, it always feels to me somehow that they're protecting that the main paradigm should be big doses with a therapist in an expensive situation. And we're going, you might not need that. We have a lot of treatment-resistant depression that doesn't need a big therapeutic intervention. And that comes back to what we've been saying, that, in a lot of ways, a full recreational dose is a kind of overdose when you compare it to using it in this way medicinally, or as this kind of vitamin pill that Jim has been describing.
So here we are. And as we know, deliberate misinformation, we know, travels at 10 times the level of truth. The people reporting on that study were perfectly nice people, and the word low dose gets no eyeballs, and the word microdosing does. So if you read it carefully, they almost acknowledge the problem in the study, but also the study took them 3 years. And when the problem again with hard science is, if you find that you are walking off a cliff, you don't go back to the funder and say, I'm returning, 29% of the money, and you get no results. So unfortunately, they started to get defensive, because really the title of their study should be Too High a Dose Prevents Microdose Effects. Mm-hmm. Which actually is a pretty good headline. I think we'll use that in our comments. But they didn't do that. They were stuck. And the head of their study had, as far as we know, had lots of experience with high dose. And the way they wrote it, knowing what we know, is they thought, what are we going to do with this? Oh, well, we said it's a microdose, but several of the people, first of all, everybody broke the blind who was on the psychedelic. Oh, well. So it's not a double-blind study. It's just, it looks like one. And why did these people who were microdosing, which we know has so little effect, drop out? Because the effects were too strong. Okay, so the kind of evidence is there. It's a sad problem, and we wouldn't worry about it, except we know that people will read it in a popular science press and say, well, I guess I'm stuck with ADHD for the rest of my life.
It's the first thing that comes up when you Google it or put it on AI. And it's one of the things we have the strongest evidence for. It actually works really well for people, depending on how you do it. And it's just... so
I guess we'll start to load AI.
So what was great about Connor's study, too, is that they tested, later on at the end of our PDF, he says he thinks they were really using 10 and 20. But there's 3 different measures, one subjective and 2 objective, where the 10 microgram people did better than the 20 microgram people. And we talk about it briefly in a footnote in the book. We couldn't get more in, but that's kind of very exciting, real science that you can't just disregard, because it's real. So there we are.
Here we are. That leads into my next question, which is, here we are, your reflections on where we are. I know I've been working with people supporting microdosing for 5 years, and it's been extraordinary, the difference between even 2020 and where people are at now. Big themes I'm seeing are more doctors, clinicians, psychotherapists, nurses coming to practice now.
Yep.
5 years ago, they were just kind of watching and waiting, but now they're all really, really coming to practice and wanting to learn to support others with this practice. I've also seen in our community, the first couple of years, people were really defensive. Once they experienced microdosing and the research would come out, or people would call it placebo, or these negative press things would come out, they would kind of come out swinging to the calls, really defensive and protective. But that has shifted recently to, I think, people have experienced so much benefit that they don't need to be convinced anymore. Right. They don't need the science to justify the results that they have had. And they're kind of like, when science proves it, that's great, but I don't need that anymore to try this. I've heard enough good things from other people.
And I really like what you wrote to us about how you're not sure you want it to be scientifically proven, because then that just opens up the commercialization in the worst way.
Yeah. I mean, once it's clinically proven.
We also people, and I do as well, totally underestimate how many people are microdosing. There's a study out 2023, the RAND Corporation, not your usual psychedelic hippie commercial company, and they said 8 million people in 2023 used psilocybin only in the USA. 4 million microdosed of the 8. So it's not only out there, it's way out there. And results actually, as we know in the advertising world, the best kind of advertising is called "somebody told me it was a good idea." So that's the way it is happening now. And fortunately, perhaps because there are certain reasons why the commercial people have not leapt in. We can talk about it if you want, but there are real reasons. And they're all about the way the United States laws are set up. They're not about science. The science is clear. It helps lots of people in lots of different conditions. It has almost no physical side effects, so it's very safe. And it has a few possible side effects, most of which, and there's a recent study out of Poland, which also suggests there's research everywhere, that said, yes, there are definite side effects in using this with just psilocybin. They are transient and mild. That's it. There was no, they didn't have the caveat, but maybe. They just said, here's what all the research tells us. We're not, we have no stake in it. We're just telling you what everybody's found out.
Mm-hmm. What do you think are the major drivers in keeping more people from finding out?
Hundreds of years of repression against enjoying the body, and the illegality of LSD and the war on drugs, and there's a lot of negative stigmas against psychedelics generally, and that's a really there's a large percentage of the population that will just never ever, just because they grew up knowing it was wrong and illegal. So that's a big block right there.
The other side of that, and it's just the opposite of what I just said, is nobody is trying to make a huge profit out of microdosing, so that when you go on Instagram, every imaginable condition has a secret formula that only one doctor in Nepal 100 years ago transcribed to his grandson. There's none of that for microdosing. So there isn't the commercial push. God knows what TikTok influencers are going to be doing with this. But all the usual capitalist methods of diffusion are not yet in play. So the fact that 8 million people used it in a given year, and that was a couple of years ago, my feeling is it's getting pretty, I get so little pushback. And when I talked to the guy who's up on my telephone pole a few days ago replacing a wire, and he says, oh, yeah, I do that. It may be like Prohibition. During Prohibition, it was easier to get alcohol than before Prohibition.
And there's also this thing that we mentioned a little bit, that some of the biggest psychedelic influencers are still on the fence, or in some cases against it. So, you hear people saying it's just a microdose. You don't hear them talking about how, maybe in the long run it could handle more of the totality of treatment-resistant depression and pain and other things in the country. And we have so many conditions we talk about than working with the therapist, but you never hear them, you never hear it talked about like that. Then you have also people like our friend Andrew Huberman, who announced himself as a micro-skeptic. And now he's talking about psilocybin a lot and all that. But the idea that these really tiny, unsupervised doses done at home could change, or maybe with a coach or guided to therapist, but, that it's not a big immersive thing where, all of your past stuff comes up and you process it and work with it, and that you can heal without any of that. It's a sort of very non-Western idea. We want to go in there and, blow things up. And this isn't like that.
It's also the therapeutic model that we all have grown up on is you need to understand what caused it. You need to have insight. You may need to relive the traumatic memory. And that has worked, say, for depression, that people benefit from therapy, and that high doses often will lead to insights. It's hard for those people who put in all those years of training, and I have all those years of training, okay? I know all that stuff. there's another way which people take a microdose and get better. Insight, none. Reliving of trauma, none. Awareness of what caused the trauma, none. And if you say to them, well, what about all that? They say, well, I'm not depressed. What are we talking about? So it's the scientific model, although it says it's objective, protects itself almost the way the religion model does.
Absolutely. Absolutely. One of the now guides who was in my program was supporting other people, and she was at a dinner party, and there was a very accomplished psychiatrist at the table. And the group was asking her about her experience with microdosing, and she was sharing some of the anecdotal stories and results she had seen. And she could see him getting bothered and put off by the stories. And so she went up to him afterward and asked him if he had thoughts or feelings to share. And he said, I don't believe in microdosing. And she said, why? And he said, I don't believe in it because I think it's a shortcut.
Ooh, morality. Right. If you haven't suffered, you don't deserve to get better.
It's a little cut. It's not a shortcut.
Actually, the reason we use shortcuts, they're a positive. The word is a positive. When people say it's a shortcut as a negative, I'm always puzzled until I find out, is it their profession or their training or their belief system that's being attacked? I mean, having come through the 60s, it was incredibly easy to upset the older generation because they didn't want to do what you'd done because you said it's so amazing and, big deal. But they also didn't have an alternative theory. So we're watching the lack of concern that younger people have, for instance, about using substances that are illegal. They've grown up, as someone was saying, from South American country. You can't possibly understand ayahuasca because for you it's illegal. And all these young people in the room said, like, what? What did you just say? You mean if I speed a little bit, I have terrible guilt feelings because I know speeding is illegal? So it was really one of those cultural differences. And I see it, what I now see with therapists, and you really said it, is therapists are saying, well, I'd like to help my patients with it. Now, the reason they do that, and this is from a lot of therapists, is therapists say over and over, my clients who are microdosing do better. And when I push on that, they say they go through stuff faster and things that they feel concerned about bringing up, they're less concerned about bringing up because it doesn't traumatize them to bring it up. So it makes therapy and that theory with insights and so forth more effective. And when that becomes pretty obvious that a therapist has a client, and the client says, well, I'm microdosing, and the therapist says, well, I can't support them. The client says, fine. And, I'll close the door on my way out and I'll go to the guy next door who picture on his wall of some South American with radiating rays coming out of his head and a blue deer in the background.
So I think this also relates to there being a stigma against, I'm going to call it magic. When you think about microdosing as a vitamin pill that can work for so many things, even if you don't put, I'm sorry to all the coaches, even if you don't put, intention and journal and have someone say, all you really have to do is take the substance, and because of the neuroplasticity and the anti-inflammatory effects and the mitochondria, all that stuff, different parts of your life can really, and that's kind of a magical event. It also opens you up to the other parts of yourself, which people might not be used to. If they're used to you being stuck in one subpersonality almost all the time, and they see you having more fluidity, people can be threatened by it. So I think that, and especially there's this relationship between a placebo and magic. Is it just working because you think it's working? How is the mind actually working with the body to produce these effects? Some of it we'll never be able to explain. There's an element of almost the spiritual or the supernatural in microdosing. And I think that just puts a lot of people off because they just don't believe in anything like that. So
what I do with such people is I say, here's the risk-reward ratio. Worst case is your blood pressure is going to go up at least 2 points. And you may, if it's mushrooms, you may have a little stomach indigestion. I recommend a way to get out of that. And if it has no other effects, then nothing's happened. However, and then I just mentioned a few of the remarkables, that's up to you.
But you wouldn't actually usually even get into that conversation with someone, which is our section in the book called The Value of Hesitation. If somebody's not interested and has any reason whatsoever to not do microdosing or any psychedelic ever in their whole life, fine.
But what I found, see, high doses, having years of people say, I wouldn't try that. And I'm saying, yes, you should. It's so terrific. And I wonder, why do they keep going back when I do that at their face? Never occurred to me early on that maybe I was making it harder for them to come to their own decision. So what we say with hesitation is if you don't feel, if you don't want to try it, then you won't. If you do try it, all I can tell you is it has very few noticeable effects. The noticeable effect that you noticed is you felt better about everything. But you could have also missed that you did a microdose. You could have said, I had breakfast and I usually don't. Might have been breakfast. Then it might have been. So we're looking at, it's hard for people who have been sold on superlatives to say, here's something which seems to help most people with a lot of different conditions because their own body does the work. That's not very sexy.
As opposed to going back to what you said earlier, with that sense of joy, I think there's something, even at the microdosing level, as you're going through a protocol that is numinous or luminous, or is somehow we're back to light, that you're more coherent as a field of light and love, just inherently. And that is also very threatening for a lot of people.
But the way Paul Stamets, world-renowned mycologist, says, people who use psilocybin are nicer. Now, notice, it's not a hard sell. It's just an observation. And you say, well, would I like to be nicer? Yeah, I guess I would. And we've overcome a lot of the exciting, but what would my therapist think? And my grandmother would say, is it in the Bible? And so forth and so on. The answer, of course, it is in the Bible. So we're at a very nice part in the culture. And the federal government, not surprisingly, is behind the times. But state by state, psilocybin and microdosing are perfectly legal in several states. There are 12 other states at the moment with laws being discussed. So we're simply seeing that there's enough legislators who say, if it doesn't hurt anybody and people benefit, and somehow there's some tax benefits, why not? And the answer to the why not is a much easier question than why.
Mm-hmm. Beautiful. One of the qualities I love so much about microdosing is it's a Trojan horse in a lot of ways. Like a lot of times, I had one client early on who was close to 80, and he's from the Northeast. And he came to me and he had heard his memory was really failing. And he was suffering some long tail COVID symptoms with his cognitive process. And he said up front, he said, Case, I'm not into any of this woo-woo stuff that you do at all. I just want to give it to me for this. And so I laughed and said, fine. Well, not only did he get the cognitive benefits and his memory came back that he was hoping for, when I talked to his adult children and his wife, without him, they all said he is a completely different person. Yes, he got the physical benefits, but he's also kinder. He is more tender.
In a better self.
He's a better self. Exactly.
But his kinder self has some space. No, one of the things we're seeing in terms of the future, which is a question we may or may not get to, we see highly likely from the not too much evidence, but it's all in one direction, improvement for potential dementia. And the nice thing is when you take a condition that everybody doesn't like and that we don't have anything for, there's a less objection. When we say you don't need to use SSRIs, microdosing seems to be better, there's a multi-billion-dollar industry that I've just attacked. But if I say your grandmother will be able to read for another year or two longer, nobody says, well, there's a whole industry that wants her not to read. There isn't. And some of the stories from older people are indeed make you cry, because why have we not been offering this before? And the answer is because there wasn't that underpinning. I mean, I'm thinking now, I now, there's kind of letters get into a certain form. The dementia form is, I really want to turn on my grandmother. Is it okay? And then I write back and say, what medications is she on? And we have to look at those first, because probably we need to help her with her medications before we get to whether she really is demented. She may not be. But it's that generation trying to help the people they love. And that's an incredibly powerful force in a culture.
And it may turn out that some of the not most common microdose agents that we talk about are particularly good for preventing and working with dementia. But we'll see where that goes.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I was so enthused to see the study recently on longevity, because that's another piece that I've certainly seen people practicing on and off with microdosing over the last 5 years. It's remarkable. Their radiance, when you get a group of people who microdose together and you see them all at once, it's really remarkable. So it's beautiful to see the science starting to look into that too.
Let me just show you a little piece of the science. There's this wonderful piece of research is you give it to old mice, because you want them to, you want a certain amount of them to die. And you find out at the end of a couple of months how many are alive. And the ones who were on who didn't get microdosed, like 80% are dead. The ones who did microdose, 55% are dead. That's a huge shift, okay? And suddenly there's a whole raft of articles about longevity with microdosing. Mushrooms will, then you read the study carefully, and you find out, but you actually were giving them a very heavy dose, like once every few weeks. You weren't microdosing, you were overdosing. And yes, it made them, they lived longer, but it's a very hard way to do that. Nobody says, I really want to turn my grandmother on with 500 mics of LSD so that she can meet her maker before she meets her maker. That's a big deal. But if you'd like her to read more or to be able to recognize her children, that's a very low barrier and one that is very easy.
Right. You don't want too much plasticity destroying what's left. You want enough of things to shift around so you can bring back the parts that are still there. That's very big.
I would love to give you both the floor. Jim, you've been in the field for so many years, have seen so much growth, and it must be fascinating from your vantage point to see this kind of take on a life of its own and become a field of, people being trained and certified in this practice. So I'd love to get your thoughts on the things you're most enthused and excited about right now in the field, and also what kind of concerns you the most.
One of the things that you learn about psychedelics is you're not in control. Yeah. And the fact that most psychedelics are either natural plants or fungi or derived from natural plants or fungi suggests that maybe there's a reason why they have these effects. And there's all these funny studies that say, well, the reason all these mushrooms have gotten psychedelics in them is it disturbs insects. And you think, oh, come on. That's more unlikely than that they've been waiting for humanity to evolve. So I'm simply seeing that it's becoming part of the culture. And what we know is that the culture is somewhat independent of the commercial culture, especially when you're dealing with natural substances. Now, the other nice thing about LSD is if you make a gram of it, that's about 10,000 doses. So that a little goes a long way. So that it sprinkles into the culture, and friends give it to friends. We're not at the place where physicians, see, the only people who can't give it to friends are physicians and psychotherapists and mental health workers. All the people who should be most able to help are prevented only by legal barriers. And those legal barriers, as I mentioned, are coming down state by state. Predominantly, the groups that are most helpful are veterans. It's really, really hard to say to a veteran, ha ha, you're suffering and I could help you, but I don't think I will because maybe we don't have a commercial, push for it. So the veterans groups are either establishing their own networks, and for high doses, they are setting up outside the United States, and everybody's supportive. And more in Congress, there are what are called veterans. And several of the veterans in Congress are the ones leading the let's stop being foolish and restricting psychedelics inappropriately and inelegantly and against science just because we passed a law 40 years ago. We have very few laws from 40 years ago about a substance that hasn't been changed because science has improved. But since the psychedelics were made illegal because of no science, just politics, they don't have that same advantage. So I'm feeling pretty good about, I think my wife says, isn't it nice you've lived long enough to see this all happening? And it is. And so when I get a letter from Serbia and a woman in English says, I'm sorry I'm writing you in English, it's not my first language, and then says, I had dementia for 5 years, and now I'm playing the piano again. So I'm not looking forward to anything. I've got it. That's so fantastic. And I wrote her back and said, please feel to write us in Serbian. Well, we can handle it. That's wonderful. And one other, this is a family in Australia, high school student, dropped out because he was failing at everything and hated it. And then his father said, would you consider microdosing over the summer? And he says, I'm not going to be one of them druggy kids like my friends in school. And then he says again, Dad, but you've become nicer lately. Have you been microdosing? He said, yes, I have. He said, I'll try it. So end of the summer, time to go back to school. He says, I want to go back to school. And I want to take all advanced placement classes. Now, remember, he's just flunked out. Asked his father, will you help me? So they go to school. All of his teachers say, no, I won't let you in the advanced placement class. But one, his math teacher, says, sure. And I love this. The math teacher says, but you'll have to learn 189% more of the curriculum in order to do what you want. The kid says, great. Finishes math, class of 35 people. He's ranked 1. He's the best student in the class. They then take the national exams. He scores highest that the school has ever had anyone score in math. Okay? Oh, the rest of his subjects, he got A's. So it doesn't get much better than that. And there's a lot of kids like him. Now, what's happening is there's also more and more fathers.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. I'm thinking in the sharing of that story, so many of my clients share that same experience. I have one client who came to me who's very senior in the government, and their original intention was to drink less alcohol. And so they began microdosing, and because of their position, they were curious and open, but also very concerned about being weird or trippy or off of their game. And 6 months later, not only had they let go of alcohol completely, they were thriving in their role, thriving in their speaking, thriving in their negotiations. And he came back to me and he said, why is everybody not doing this? I am better in literally every single way. And he joked and said, I'm kind of glad they don't yet. Because he said, I feel like I have this superpower, especially when I'm making deals and doing negotiations and speaking, that I didn't have before. So, yeah, remarkable.
Well, that's the same kind of superpower that some of the athletes, whether it's judo or tennis or whatever they're doing, they literally have, whether it's a dilated time sense or however they're able more to tune in. And so one of the exciting things that we have going on is the website, which is Microdosing Book, one word, microdosingbook.com, because we have a place where we invite people to ask questions or tell stories. And every few weeks, a story comes in that just kind of blows us both away. Like we got one about a guy with Tourette's who figured out something, and then that's a whole story. And we got this guy who, has terrible 44 operations. And the only thing that worked with him was LSD and psilocybin on the same day. But after many years, all of his pain is gone. And we keep learning, unusual data points that we wouldn't have ever thought of.
So one of the things we would like to ask those of you who have joined us is if you have a story that you'd like to share with us, if you have a question you'd like to ask us, microdosingbook.com. And the chances of you getting answered are very high. And almost all the stories that I just told you came from individuals who we've never met, number from other countries. So we are using our kind of visibility, also feedback loop, to make that feedback loop for other people. So we would like to invite you to enjoy and enhance our work and the work that you've done with our beautiful host. I still think in my mind hostess, but I don't say that.
and just to kind of close us off, I know we're about done with time. We talked about the magical and the numinous and the luminous and the joy and the ecstasy. From wherever psychedelics originally come from, it seems like it really is something that can help re-sacralize the world and bring that sense of luminous light that is actually part of everything, that it's just so hard to pay any attention to with everything, the radiation in the air, to all of the channels on social media. I mean, it's not easy in the news, of course, to actually be present and in your body and to really enjoy it and kind of light up from within in a good way. But I think this is part of that. And, all these stories that are spreading, like Jim was saying, you've seen people too, this is part of the older generation that doesn't believe in something, is kind of moving out, and the new generation is coming in. It's very rare when you change an ultra skeptic's mind. It's not worth the effort, and it almost never happens. But there's a lot of people who are coming to their own conclusions for the first time. And while people still disparage our anecdotal data, despite the fact that there's more and more real world data in Conor Murray's, they say, oh, you only have anecdotal data. It's when you read these stories and you hear these stories from people who have nothing to gain by sharing these stories, or if you try it yourself, you realize that there's a whole huge, powerful, magical world of healing and transformation right here in a very safe way. It almost seems too good to be true, but it's the way it is.
So the word anecdotal makes me kind of, gag, okay? What it really is, it's a way of deprecating what we call real world experience. And the goal of every pharmaceutical you've ever taken was not to make it in the laboratory, not to keep the mice happy. It was so that when your physician says, you have a such and such, maybe this will help you, this is new, and hands it to you. Out of the lab, real world, all of the difficulties, and you come back and you say, I feel better, thank you. That's what we're seeing. And when someone says, it hasn't been proved, meaning has it been dried up and dissected and put into a sterile system called a laboratory? And the answer is, it resists, and even in there, it seems to work. Mm-hmm. But that's not the ideal situation. That's the least ideal situation. The best ideal situation is my grandmother has thanked me so many times for being able to read again. And she's also saying, I'm now taking walks that I wasn't able to do 3 months ago. That is, if we think about it, that's clearly far more useful in what we call real science, which is paying attention and making generalization from best possible is real world experience, because that's what you're going to end up with at the other end. Pharmaceuticals don't have that beginning. They can't. They start with a molecule that they've made up of some other molecule, and it has to go through all of these excellent safety and security and so forth before anyone tries it. Natural substance, do it the other way. That's how we got aspirin. We didn't invent it. We found a plant that had it, and we found we could extract that piece of the plant, and you didn't have to have as much plant to get the same effect. So we're working the way.
Well, this is how science happens. For instance, the Royal Academy in England in the 1670s. I mean, until we can't,
until data and statistics
and
began to be the new kind of
currency.
The kind of gatekeepers.
Yeah, the epistemological gatekeeper.
Right. Oh, and I like that.
And then you have the whole thalidomide thing made it got to be double-blind placebo controlled for everything. And it's like, that wasn't, the researchers didn't want that. The university, it was just kind of mandated out of the blue in a hysterical reaction to what happened with thalidomide. So making that the way that it has to be, and then, double saying that that's the only thing that counts, it's ludicrous.
So we're very pro what we would call useful science. We're less pro ideological science. And we're really against religious dogmatism science, which
Charlie Tart called scientism.
Scientism, right. Right. The religion where if it isn't science, it didn't happen.
But what's interesting for me, and this is that you see these same discussions happening here as happening in people looking at proof for whether parapsychology, ASP, psi exists or not. And I'm Dean Radin of Noetic Sciences, has yet another new book. And, when you look at the data overall, it's really clear that this stuff goes on a lot of the time in odds of so high to 1 that we know it's going on. And yet you'll still have most real scientists saying, well, we don't think it's real.
I worked with I was lecturing to medical students. And they were wonderful. They were open, and a lot of them had psychedelic experience, and that's why I was being asked. But what I began to see is they basically were saying, I like to be a medical student because I could say, show me the data. And by that, I meant a peer-reviewed journal article. And until you tell me it's a peer-reviewed journal article, I can no longer make a decision whether I believe it or not. So I was watching these students trying to overcome, and with their own personal experience was being overweighed by the dogma of peer-reviewed, and there was a moment of, great sadness. But then again, I've met physicians a few years later, and they get over it.
Oh, one last thing about dogma. There's a new paper called the Lexicon with some very famous psychedelic researchers that defines microdosing as being functionally synonymous with placebo. And we're just aghast that they have, they need to read this PDF that we wrote about, Connor Murray and what he's done from this discussion on the Clubhouse, because anyone will read that and know that that's just not right.
So we have there's a wonderful term that Maslow invented called meta-grumbles. That's when you're grumbling about the level of justice rather than that there's no justice. So we're hoping to move pretty quickly, and we are with the public, into meta-grumbles, which is there are papers which are nonsense, meta-grumble. The fact that they're doing research on microdosing, we're thrilled. Okay, a few years ago, everybody said, well, I'm not going to work on microdosing because nobody's going to fund it. And they found out, no, nobody will fund it. But everyone in the lab says, I'm going to donate my time. So we're at a wonderful place. And the work that you've done over these years, and there's people like that person we hope is still in the federal government. Because, and I love what he said. He said, I'm nicer. Okay. Where have we heard that in this program?
And we have some good news. We're going to have a British paperback coming out in the new year. We're going to have an American paperback coming out in the next year. We're going to have a Portuguese edition coming out, and I'm not sure Spanish.
Spanish edition is coming out.
So that's exciting.
And the only reason they're coming out because the publishers in those countries are seeing the same thing we're seeing. is there people that are going to want that book? So here we are.
Wonderful. Wonderful. I just want to take a moment to say, on behalf of, I know so many people in our community and people listening, just to thank you both for all of your work and dedication and voice, and really, really championing the way you have around real world practice, because I've certainly appreciated that fully over the last 5 years.
But we feel, you see, the nice thing is we feel the same thing about you, that you put in this incredible number of hours, you're helping an incredible number of people, you've learned a huge amount, so that when you go through the book with you, it's mainly, oh, yeah, oh, I didn't know about that one, yeah. So you're one of our big resources, because we don't give drugs to anybody. We don't, we're not running any kind of practice. We're not facilitating. We're taking information that you have created and repurposing it so it can go out in a different form and to a wider group. So this is a team podcast. This is not a interviewer, people who do stuff podcast. And we're thrilled and very happy to be with you.
Thank you both so much. Yeah, beautiful. So we'll list all of the links that we talked about in the show notes for you guys. Definitely a link to the book, and Jordan, we'll have to get your write-up on the research too. And
I can give you. So it's a bit.ly link that goes to my Google Drive. It's really short, and it's the curated Murray conversation. It's very clear, and Connor is a great expositor, and I was able to shape where I wanted him to go. And it's mostly him talking, but at one point I do a long sum up and I say, "You agree, yes?" And he says, "Correct." Like, made it. Let me be really happy. I got it. I got the fish. I bagged the whatever,
That sounds like him. Awesome. Well, thank you both. And thank you everybody so much for being here. Thank you for listening. And we'll see you back in a couple weeks.
Wonderful.
Right. Thank you, Kate.
Thank you for listening to the Microdosing for Healing podcast. Ready to take the next step? Please visit us online at microdosingforhealing.com. There you'll find lots of information about our global community, professional training programs, and upcoming immersions. See you there.